Hello, I'm mischievous Mark Ginocchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy number 15, and all of the Amazing Spider-Man annuals, even the transition ones, but I still think all of them do not count.
And I'm Dapper Dan Gavosant, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including those same transition annuals, which I say definitely count. I mean, Amazing Spider-Man annual number 20, how could you forget it? But for me, Amazing Fantasy 15 remains a fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a transition book. Amazing Fantasy number 15, right? I mean, you know, what happened? They didn't even address 14. Anyway, welcome to the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe. Thanks for joining us for episode 1 of season 7 of the Amazing Spider Talk, a revolving door of talent.
A revolving door of talent. That's another name for our podcast.
Ho-ho!
Ho-ho! If you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review to help spread the word about our show. If you're just tuning in to season 7 and you've not listened to anything before, go check out the previous seasons and subscribe to get all of that stuff and to keep up with this season as we work our way through this era.
That's right. We ain't just reviews, folks. This podcast exists because of the support of our Patreon members. If you want to receive early episodes, including those from this season, exclusive artwork in the mail, and of course, help Dan and I keep this podcast going, go to AmazingSpiderTalk.com and consider joining our Patreon.
In this season of the Amazing Spider Talk, that's season 7, we're traveling back to the late 80s and early 90s to an era of Spider-Man's history that saw his comic completely visually reinvented, with sales reaching a peak that will likely never be replicated, and a whole host of creative voices that would go to change the comic industry forever. Yes, we're talking about the early half of writer David Michelinie's run on Amazing Spider-Man, where he worked alongside the founders of Image Comics, Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson, married off Peter Parker, and introduced the world to the hottest villain since the days of Ditko, none other than Venom.
That's a lot of legacy there, Dan. But in this episode, you and I, we're going to be talking about the fallout of the truncated or abbreviated end of the DeFalco Frenz run on Amazing Spider-Man, which left the creative voices leading the title in doubt. In the wake of this abrupt departure, DeFalco and Frenz, and the messy end, of course, of Gang War, which included, among other things, Daredevil in a fat suit, as well as the deeply unsatisfying Hobgoblin reveal, which was probably worse than Daredevil in a fat suit, as well as the editorial shakeups, up and downs of the Marvel line, Amazing Spider-Man went into a transition period. You see, folks, we brought it back to the transition joke. Anyway, so there were a ton of new voices coming on and off the title, including David Michelinie, John Romita Jr., Alex Saviuk, Jan DeMatteis, Mike Zeck, and Nocenti, and Cindy Martin. That's a lot of names, folks. The result was a confusing time to be a Spider-Man fan, but also contained some of the most celebrated Spider-Man stories of all time, and the first female writer-dependent issue of Amazing Spider-Man, as well as some major status quo changes for Spidey's world.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff happening in a short period of time, like less than a year. But if you want to read along with our conversation, we'll be talking specifically about Amazing Spider-Man numbers 290 to 297, Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 21, Web of Spider-Man numbers 31 through 33, Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man numbers 131 to 133, as well as some of the other transition periods in Spider-Man's history. All of these issues can be found on the Marvel Unlimited app, and many have been collected over the years in the Epic Collections numbers 17 and 18, as well as the various Kraven's Last Hunt graphic novel printings. There's been like half a dozen of those. Chances are you can find one of those fairly easily. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's that like brief period in like 1987, 88, where the Spider-Man books suddenly changed. Christopher Priest / Jim Owsley was leading the Spider-Man line, and stuff kind of changed with that whole mix-up there at the end with people getting fired and more people getting fired. Mark, can you tell us a little bit about that and who it brought onto the title for the first time?
Absolutely, Dan. But I do have to kick off this conversation by just, pointing out to folks, and, obviously I've talked about this a fair amount over the years, but I need to say it definitively. I started reading Amazing Spider-Man in the smack dab middle of this transition period. My first issue of this comic was Amazing Spider-Man number 296. So it's the second to last issue that in this run that we're going to be talking about before it properly became Michelinie McFarlane. So despite all of the changes and people coming and going, this period made me a fan for life. So go figure, right, Dan? I mean, yeah, who could have imagined one of the foremost voices of Spider-Man started in this run? So there you go. But I think we really can't get into what this run meant and why it became as legendary as it did. And by this run I mean not just these issues, but also just the entirety of Michelinie, McFarlane, Larson, etc., without talking about Jim Salicrup. Jim Salicrup took over from Jim Owsley, Christopher Priest in right after the end of the Hobgoblin saga, if you will. And we interviewed Jim. Was one of our very first creator interviews way back at the first time I ever met Dan in the flesh in 2013 at was then known as Connecticut Comic-Con. Now it's of course Terrificon, where Dan and I have also attended multiple times over the years. It's like our homecoming, Dan, every time we go back to upstate Connecticut, if you will. In that interview, Jim talked a little bit about what some of his priorities were when he took over as editor, because he realized like this book was in a bit of disarray. We talked about it a bunch at the end of our last season, what happened with Gang War and of course the Hobgoblin, and Salicrup's mantra was basically clean up the books, restore order in the Spider Office following the several years of chaos during DeFalco and Frenz and Owsley running amok, as well as peak Jim Shooter, who was the editor-in-chief of Marvel. We had Jim on at Terrificon, in fact, a couple of years ago. But Jim was known as a very polarizing force. Is that even a kind way of putting it? I don't know, Dan.
I was gonna say hands-on editor,
yes,
but polarizing is good too.
Yeah. I mean, so you got to keep in mind, like during these issues, like Shooter was eventually forced out of Marvel in April 1987 and replaced by Tom DeFalco. And if you go through these issues, the first Amazing Spider-Man issue that listed DeFalco as Marvel's editor-in-chief was Amazing Spider-Man number 294. So again, it's like halfway through the halfway transition point. It's literally the second part of a Kraven's Last Hunt issue. There's a new editor-in-chief of Marvel. Surprise! Dan, let's just start this off by talking about the editorial stuff and whether or not you felt like Salicrup was able to kind of do what he was set out to do in terms of just kind of restoring order to this book.
Well, and I did want to give a shout out. If you want to listen to that interview from that we did with Jim Salicrup, that's Superior Spider Talk number 12. And then I believe very early in our time as Amazing Spider Talk, or the end of Superior Spider Talk, I did an interview with Tom DeFalco specifically about his very short tenure as editor-in-chief, where he gives some further insight into this period. So check out both of those interviews. Talk about a job boost, getting let go from Amazing Spider-Man and suddenly finding yourself editor-in-chief. I don't know if Tom DeFalco saw it that way. I think he was kind of thrown into that role unexpectedly, and kind of trying to plug holes in the boat. What do I think of Salicrup's mantra, and did he fulfill it? I mean, it's hard to say how many of the books in this short run were truly the work of Jim Salicrup, in that he kind of came in and I think a lot of these stories were stories that weren't supposed to be in Amazing Spider-Man that got elevated into that position. And I don't know what kind of work he necessarily did to facilitate the creation of these stories that have probably been simmering for some time. But there are some all-time great stories from here in this particular era, Craven's Last Hunt being one of them. There's other interesting experiments like the Mad Dog Ward that crossed a bunch of titles. So there's a lot of experimentation going on here. I don't know that you can see the full fruits of his labor quite here, but I think on the other end of this, you can really see that Salicrup cleaned up the line, gave each book, I think, more distinctive an identity than it had they had been having beforehand. And so as a transition period, we've got some great stories, some like status quo resets, and real talent that suddenly found its way onto the book. That's kind of the job of an editor, is to tell great stories, bring in great talent, and attract a lot of people. I don't think you could consider any of his work here a failure. Like, all of that happened and more.
Oh, for sure. So it's always funny to me because, like, if you actually go back and go through Jim Salicrup's credits, he was kind of a fill-in writer and editor for Marvel. I mean, he actually did his prior history with Spider-Man was the Spidey Super Stories, aka the Electric Company comic books or the books that went on to inspire the Electric Company. So you're kind of like, oh, what's this guy? How is he gonna have an impact? And like I'm gonna start this chat off with a bit of a hot take here, or maybe it's not a hot take, Dan, but I think Jim Salicrup was probably the most successful editor in Amazing Spider-Man history. I think that he, kind of came in from a chaotic period. Jim Owsley, Christopher Priest, obviously. He talked about it a bit in our interview with him several years ago. And if you go to his blog posts that we've talked and referenced a lot over the years, he talks about it. But he had a vision and, in terms of how he wanted to kind of model each of the three books and do all these things. But he clearly lacked the management skills, especially as it came to talent relations, because he, frankly, Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz still, I think, harbor a lot of resentment for Christopher Priest, as we've kind of has been insinuated to us directly. The fact that
insinuated is doing a lot of work.
I'm trying to be very diplomatic here, Dan.
Sure.
But Jim Salicrup, I think, took some of that vision, maybe kind of scaled it back a little bit, but he just had a great skills as a manager, because you figure, you look at some of the talent he had to manage during this period, and I'm talking about the transition period, but also kind of going and beyond, in terms of Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson. And I mean, David Michelinie he wrote one of the most famous runs of Iron Man before coming on to Amazing Spider-Man. So these were all major name talent that Salicrup was mad. He brought Jerry Conway back to the book. Alex Saviuk, who was kind of like Stan Lee's favorite son, like next to John Romita Sr., I think. I mean, like, it was just like, like a lot of talent, a lot of legendary big names, both within the Spider Office and just outside of it, and kind of stitched this book back to health. And yeah, I mean, like, these are quote unquote, it's a hodgepodge of stories. A lot of it was inventory stuff, and we'll get into some of the specifics of that. But like, it all works. And like, even for inventory stuff, this is some legendary stories just in less than a year's time that this guy put together. I mean, like, who else could say that from a run of inventory stories, right? I mean, that's crazy to me.
Yeah, as much as I like Amazing Spider-Man 700.1 and .2, there's nothing quite like this era. You make a really strong case for Salicrup as an editor, and he makes the case himself by being a strong editor. What I would consider like a Spider Office. Like, this is where that kind of idea really kind of came to full fruition. With the number of titles. I mean, under his, tenure, we got 4 concurrent Peter Parker Spider-Man titles that had to weave between each other. I mean, that would obviously like go on, to take its full fruition in the Clone Saga, where like they really truly weaved into each other. But like to kind of kick that off and really be managing that kind of, load of titles is a big deal. We give Steve Wacker a lot of credit for running the Spider-Man line, in the 2000s, where he was doing, a bi-monthly Peter Parker title along with all the other books. And that certainly took a lot of work to round up that writing team. But also, I think, Salicrup's task was equally Herculean, and really turned out some quality books that have redefined the character for audiences for a long time.
For sure. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about like what were some of the big tentpole ideas, if you will, from this era. I mean, I know we said we were going to start with 290, and I'm cheating by talking about, I guess, 289, but I think it still technically counts as kind of like the handoff to Salicrup, which was basically resolving the Hobgoblin story. And like, again, referring to that interview we did back in 2013, I mean, Jim Salicrup basically knew that story was the dog's breakfast, if you will, but he was just like, look, we had to move on. He was like, he's like, I think at the time he said, everyone's moved on but you, Mark. I'm like, okay, I moved on, but I'm just asking questions, right? But it was like, he knew that the whole reveal of the Hobgoblin was poorly botched because of the infighting between DeFalco and Frenz and Priest. So he just like had Peter David do what Peter David thought was the most sensible solution, which was Ned Leeds. He basically boxed out Christopher Priest and then made Christopher Priest write to Peter David's resolution in Web of, and then it was just like, it's over. No more Hobgoblin until basically the Demon Goblin showed up in Inferno a couple of years later, and that was that. And it allowed them to finally kind of like clear out and like, okay, we're gonna do some inventory stuff until before we move into the McFarlane run with Michelinie. But like, how did we kick off the inventory run? Well, probably by doing the most famous or maybe infamous story of all time, which was marrying Peter and Mary Jane. And like, again, like this is it kind of showing the strength of Salicrup here. This whole concept was really nobody's idea but Jim Shooter's. We can go back to the interview from Terrificon in 2022, but I also write about it extensively in my 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die. But there and frankly, this has been a very discussed topic, especially in the light of One More Day and the dissolution of the marriage. But like, basically, at the time, none of the creators affiliated with Spider-Man, that includes DeFalco, Frenz, Jerry Conway, all of them, none of them wanted to marry Peter Parker and Mary Jane. Even David Michelinie, who was going to do the issue, he talks about it in our interview with him. He's like, well, I was gonna do it, but I wanted to do something kind of unique and different, and Jim Shooter was just like, what the hell is this? No. So he didn't get to do it. The only artist who would do it was Paul Ryan, because he was basically like, if I don't do it, I'll be fired and never get to work again for the rest of my life. I mean, these are all things people have said on the record about Jim Shooter and this story. So like, I'm not just being cheeky here, Dan.
Yeah, and I think like even leading up to that annual that actually married them off, like, issue 290 starts, with Peter kind of like reconciling his life as Spider-Man and deciding, he seeks out his childhood microscope, which, has its own kind of sordid story, whether it was destroyed or lost or not, or he sold it away or whatever. There's a million different takes on where that microscope went. But he kind of like heals this divide between him and Spider-Man and decides, I need to focus on Peter, and that means I need to get married to MJ, and he proposes to her. And I actually think like this issue 290 and 291 are what sell me on the marriage more than the wedding issue itself, and sell me on Michelinie as a writer. Like, following this story is a beautiful follow-up to All My Past Remembered from, the DeFalco and Frenz run. And it sees like MJ, fleeing town, to visit Gail, her sister, who's in jail. And there's this whole drama with, their father, and Peter going to, leaving town with the Spider Slayer hot on his heels, to kind of bail out MJ and her family. And if there was any story, and I know we talked about this last season with the Gullicksons from Comic Book Couples Counseling, but if there's any story that could sell me on this pairing, I think this is probably about the best. If you had to sell it to me in 2 issues, this is probably the best you could possibly do. And I think it's really a solid story. And rereading it before, coming on this show to do this episode, it really stood out to me. Like, no wonder they hired Michelinie to come on the book. Like, this is a really character-driven, fun action tale. Like, if he was biting the bullet of marrying off Peter and MJ, he still gave it his all.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I also feel like you got to credit Saviuk there for kind of pulling this together. I mean, they had a mandate, and we talk about this a lot now, in terms of like, oh, well, what's really in the Spider Office's control versus what's coming from, on high on the mountaintop. And, I feel like we kind of use that as a way to hand wave stories that, frankly, we don't feel are satisfactory. And yet here is something, again, everyone is on the record saying, I don't want to do this. Don't make me do this. And they did it.
Yeah.
And it was pretty good, all things considered. I mean, there are some elements of it that feel kind of truncated and unearned. And yet it's, unearned, and we'll talk about this in the episode that we dedicated to it. But for something that's so unearned and kind of rushed together, it certainly has its defenders.
Yeah, I have become a convert. And I think it's on the strength of these 2 issues.
Yeah.
And how they play with the history of the title. So, to me, that's a really exciting thing to kick off this transition with. And the promise of what David Michelinie could bring to the book moving forward.
Definitely. Now, in addition to the wedding and the proposal issues, the other, of course, big transition, and this is truly a transition story, because this took Michelinie and the kind of the entourage of artists, it was John Romita Jr., among others, out of it, was Kraven's Last Hunt. And we talked to J.M. DeMatteis again at Terrificon or Connecticut Comic-Con in 2013 about this. And for the record, J.M. DeMatteis does not want to talk about Kraven's Last Hunt anymore. He's going to still answer questions about it from people, I'm sure. But I will confirm with certainty he doesn't want to talk to. He loves talking to us. He doesn't want to talk to us about a Kraven's Last Hunt anymore. I think JMD is Kraven's Last Hunt out. Just for all you out there, if you run into him. But with that said, as he talked about during that interview, this is of course famous as it wasn't even actually a Spider-Man story. This was an original pitch by JMD was as a Wonder Man story, and that ended up getting rejected by Marvel because they felt it was too similar to Wonder Man's established origin story. And then JMD actually shopped this concept to DC as a Batman story. And then that was rejected because they were already doing, I think it was Batman Year One at that point in the book. So they didn't want to do another big Batman event. Of course, JMD would end up basically taking his pitch and adapting it further for Batman in the 90s with Going Sane in the, I think it's the Dark Knight miniseries. Anyway, so Kraven's Last Hunt brings in Mike Zeck, who had worked with JMD on Captain America. They also brought in the villain Vermin, who they created in Captain America, and they are basically making Kraven from a punchline into one of the deadliest villains in Spider-Man's history because he successfully buries Spider-Man alive. It's also the first Spider-Man crossover event. as you well argued in our 400th episode, Dan. So congratulations. I still think the tablet saga counts as a crossover, but that's neither here nor there. It doesn't say it on the cover. I never forget.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And then really this is where you start getting outside of that annual, the official marriage status quo.
Yep.
And it's really baked into the story. Now, I don't think we realized quite how baked into the story it was at the time, in that most of the issue is MJ, looking out a window with rain, worrying about Peter. And she does do a little light adventuring, on her own as well, including a sequence where a woman gets eaten by vermin.
Right.
But that would become kind of a cliche over the next 20 years of stories, or 15 years of stories, or however long it was. But it was there, reflected in the comic, and a central theme to the story is that they're a newly married couple, and Peter is not showing up, and how does MJ respond to that? And that makes the story interesting too. Is this is a reflection of a brand new status quo.
Yeah. So I mean, again, not to keep beating the same drum over and over again, but good showing of a strong editor that they were able to take this story that wasn't even written for Spider-Man and integrate it in a way where it seamlessly flows from one transition story to the next. The transition stories transition into each other, even though they were kind of written in a vacuum from each other. And I think that's pretty cool. 'Cause I don't mean to disparage the current run of Spider-Man, Dan, but I don't know if we would see that today.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah.
The next story continues that sort of crossover across the titles. I wouldn't say trend, but it must have worked out well enough with Kraven's Last Hunt that they decided to continue doing this. And that is Life in the Mad Dog Ward, which, I don't think this story is talked about with any reverence, other than for the fact that it's written by Daredevil's Ann Nocenti, the first female writer on Amazing Spider-Man, which, I think is really kind of almost by accident.
Right.
My read on this was that this was not to be featured in Amazing Spider-Man, but with the gap that came in, she gets it by technicality, this is not a great feminist moment in the history of Spider-Man comics, one that still has really truly yet to come in 2024, although maybe that changes next week with the release of Justina Ireland's first issue of Amazing Spider-Man. But what do you think about Life in the Mad Dog Ward?
I mean, it's forgettable, which is me being kind to it. It's a very confusing story because I think if I'm being completely honest, of all of the kind of inventory stories that got deployed during this run, I mean, this one feels like it's the most in the vacuum. It's it basically kind of reads like a writer exercise where basically Nocenti's oh well, let's see what happens if Peter accidentally goes into a mental institute and is among the patients. I mean, it's basically One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but Spider-Man style. And it's how does
there's a sort of a Manchurian Candidate kind of thing with this too. They're taking these patients and brainwashing them so that they become super soldiers, for Kingpin's army and stuff like that. It's interesting because both this and Kraven's Last Hunt see Peter removed for days at a time from his life.
Right.
Especially so early into the marriage. That I think probably because that's what helps with these inventory stories. If they don't touch on, the kind of associated figures in Peter's life, then that means that they can truly be inserted wherever they need to be. But I think JMD did it more successfully with Kraven's Last Hunt, if only because it's a better story too, than Life in the Mad Dog Ward.
Yeah, for sure. And look, I mean, it's not. I don't think it's a terrible story, but like it's just it
No,
just
no.
doesn't really stand out. But you're right. I mean, it does win on a technicality for being a first. And I actually quite like Nocenti's Daredevil with John Romita Jr. So I don't think it's any knock on her, but it's definitely just kind of something that is thrown in there. The
No, Nocenti has a singular voice, and I think it is present in this. I mean, she injects her kind of politics into these things and has a really interesting perspective and tends to do stuff that's very different than anybody else at that time. And I think this, it does tackle mental health, issues and, being that this is kind of like Reagan era comic booking, that was very much in the like cultural discussion, about like, how does the country treat, people with mental illness. So, this stuff was spinning straight out of the newspaper and that makes it interesting too.
Yeah. Now, speaking of mental health, or maybe I'm not speaking of it, but the other story from this run of comics was kind of focused on resetting Dr. Octopus and also getting basically the artist share ready for Todd McFarlane. It's the two-parter that ran in 296 and 297, aka my first two comics, with Michelinie and Alex Saviuk with John Byrne covers. John Byrne has had this habit of just like throwing some covers together, and they were usually Doc Ock covers. And but I actually like these two covers better than his Web of covers with Doc Ock. Do you have any take on these two covers from Byrne?
Yeah, I like them. I don't want to knock your first comics. I think they're a little silly, the kind of like spider that is dressed in Spider-Man's costume and stuff like that.
Sure.
Though I like his Web of covers, I think a little more than this, but like they're good covers. And they definitely convey the narrative, I think, really well, that plays out inside of them. I am curious, about your connection to these covers because, if these are your first comics, there was something about that cover that spoke to you. At least I know that was true for me in my first Spider-Man comic. The cover obviously pulled me in. Was there something about these covers that stood out to you?
I think it was actually more the interiors, and I think a lot of that had to do with Alex Saviuk, because I think Alex Saviuk, we've talked about him, and we've interviewed him too, New York Comic Con back in 2013. He's a classic Spider-Man artist. I mean, he evokes John Romita Sr., so much so that he became basically a favorite collaborator with Stan Lee in Stan's kind of like, comic book strip days. And he was just, the perfect kind of artist to get in to do these kind of otherwise forgettable, because they were forgettable stories. I mean, like as a even though they were my first Spider-Man comics, I must have either through like animation or maybe like the Secret War action figures or something like that, I was like, wait, why is Doc Ock like such a chump in these books? You know what I mean? Like I just remember being like, Doc Ock, isn't he like a big bad villain? And like why is he scared? It didn't make sense to me. So I had that much on.
Yeah, well, for context, like this is post Owl Octopus War, right?
Yes.
Where Spider-Man just decimates Dr. Octopus and rips his arms off. And so like here, like Dr. Octopus is suffering like PTSD where he sees Spider-Man everywhere and is terrified of him. And he tries to relaunch his criminal campaign only to be like thwarted, not even by Spider-Man, but just by the mere presence of Spider-Man. But ultimately ends up getting his mojo back kind of by the end of them.
Yeah, which, wouldn't really factor in until probably when Eric Larson came on to do the Return of the Sinister Six. But, they did like kind of set it up that Doc Ock would be a major villain again by the end of it. And that's always, I think the world is right when Doc Ock is a nemesis and not, something else. But yeah, I really do think a lot of it was Saviuk. I mean, like I still, and I think it was 297 that the opening splash page of like Spidey in the rain, like, you know, he ran out of web fluid and he's just like, oh, now what do I do? You know, like this doesn't happen to Captain America. You know what I mean? Like it's like one of those books, and it's you wouldn't be able to tell from looking at some of the visuals and Michelinie's script if you were reading this book in 1965 or 1988. You know what I mean? And I think that's that classic aesthetic and tone is what hooked me for the duration of my fandom here.
So cool. Thanks for sharing that, Mark.
Yeah.
The next story is one that I've expressed some fondness for over the years. We've talked about, the death of Jean DeWolf, I guess in our previous season, written by Peter David. And that story obviously stars the villain, the Sin Eater. And this era, in Spectacular marked the return of the Sin Eater. Stan Carter, gets out of prison somehow. And
like you do.
I guess like you do. Again, dealing with mental illness and the kind of like aging up of the material from the mid 80s where like psychology became a major part of this. Like Stan is clearly someone that suffered acute mental illness, and so he's trying to kind of like rehabilitate himself in a world that only sees him as the Sin Eater. And what I like about this story, I think even more than I like the death of Jean DeWolf story, is that it really feels like a Spider-Man story. You've got the police that are like, coming after, Stan Carter, who is also kind of pointing a finger at the chief of police as being a bad guy, while Spider-Man is also being accused of murder. And so like it creates this like unusual allyship where Spider-Man is trying to get everyone to believe in the rehabilitation possibilities for Stan Carter, which I think is something we don't see enough of with Spider-Man following through on his mantra of like, using his power responsibly, which is to like stick up for the fact that maybe these guys could be healed. And it handles it in a fairly like, I think mature and interesting way. I don't know that I want to necessarily get into how it ends if people haven't read it. But like it's still kind of the ending of it still haunts me to this day because it creates such a sympathetic character out of Stan Carter and puts Spider-Man in a position where, not only does he stand to like lose no matter what he does, but it only stands to kind of like further, entrench him in like the negative mind or viewpoint from New Yorkers about like what, causes he champions. And so, I think it makes for a pretty interesting Spider-Man story, the like of which we rarely have seen since.
Yeah, I like these books a lot. I often allude to these when I talk about like favorite Electro stories, just because it's like whatever. Even as a original Ditko villain, you don't get a lot of good Electro stories, and this is one that features him pretty prominently. Obviously, that and yeah, like it feels more at its core a Spider-Man story than I think the original Sin Eater story does, as we talked about. So this is a fun one too. And obviously transition for Spectacular, but we're gonna count it. Dan, do we want to talk a little bit about the Slack? And before we talk a little bit more broadly about what these periods mean for comics?
Yeah, sure. Speaking of transition, Mark, tell us about the Slack.
Hey, I think I need a Jim Salicrup to help with that transition, but that's okay. Anyway, hundreds of listeners like you hang out in our community of Spider-Man fans on Slack. The amazing Spider Slack community is absolutely free to join, and you can jump into active conversations with awesome people about collecting, conventions, movies, new comics, old comics, and more. Dan, what is happening in the Slack this week, which could be 2 weeks from now based on when this runs, but just work with me here, Dan. What's happening in the Slack at this time?
Yeah, well, it may be months after we record this that this hits the main feed, but next week is the release of Kraven the Hunter, the movie, which is tracking fairly negatively. It's been delayed a number of times. We've been hearing about this for half a decade or more, Mark. It's finally coming. Aaron Taylor Johnson as Kraven the Hunter. The trailers have been weird. I've actually watched the first 9 minutes of the movie because they released it online, and I thought it was actually kind of solid, at least in terms as like an actioner. I don't know that it will satisfy me as a Spider-Man fan. Mark, are you planning on seeing like this one in the theater? Like, I like the director of this movie. Like, I think there might be potential here, at least more than Madam Web and Morbius. Does this have your attention at all?
I'm curious about it just for the reasons you mentioned, and also just because like I feel like more so than I had. So with the Sony movies, I had issues with the Venom movies because I was just like, you can't do Venom without Spider-Man. You know what I mean? Like, it just never. And I saw the first. I still haven't seen the last two Venom movies because like I know how I didn't even see Carnage yet, but I just like. I thought the first movie was patently absurd in an unenjoyable way, like not even in a hate watch kind of way. I was like, I do not enjoy this. So I apologize to all the people I'm offending with that opinion. I did not go and seek out Morbius or Madam Web because those movies seemed even more patently absurd, and I also just don't care about the characters in general. Like, you could put Tom Holland in a Madam Web movie and I might hesitate from seeing it because I just like I don't like Madam Web as a character, and nor do I really like Morbius. Like I mean Morbius was Roy Thomas's way of, we could do vampires now. I just don't care. You know what I mean? Like, good job. You did Morbius. But Kraven, obviously there's a legacy there, and yeah, I'm curious. Now with that said, I saw, as of this recording, I saw Gladiator 2 yesterday with my dad, and that's the maybe the third movie I've seen in a theater this year, this calendar year. Like, it's just hard for me to get out and see movies. And there's no way I'm going to get my wife or my son to see this with me. So this is going to require me going to a movie by myself, which I'm not opposed to doing, but like, it's just going to be about finding the time to do it, which might be hard, but I'll try. If not, it'll probably be on Netflix within the next 2 months. So, there'll be that.
Yeah, well, I can't bring myself to even watch. I haven't seen Madam Web yet. I can't bring myself to watch it, even though it is streaming. It's just like, I have a 2-year-old, so my time is already fairly limited.
Right.
So like, to even think about like putting down, like using my time, like precious time to do that seems like a big investment. And which is weird to say as a Spider-Man podcast. Like, we should probably be watching these things to talk about them. Maybe we should like make a Patreon like goal that like you and I will find the time to watch these things and talk about them.
Sure.
And make fun of them. But I think I'm going to carve out time to see Kraven. If only because like there's a real character there that like has a moral like core, and I'm interested to see how like that might get translated to the screen. I think it's a bizarre thing that Sony has chosen to focus on these villains in the way that they have, which presumably I think is all just to create their own Sinister Six movie of some kind, which is a lot of like the cart leading the horse. Like, they own the Spider-Man property. Just do a movie about another universe's Spider-Man.
Right.
Like, how hard is that? But I do think this one is going to be a box office bomb and potentially lay the seeds for the end of the Sonyverse, at least in its current form, which I think a lot of people will be really grateful for. And that's, at least that's what people are saying in the Slack. But, I am moderately curious about Kraven the Hunter. But then I go back and watch that first trailer where it showed him getting like the blood of a lion dropped into his veins, and that's where he gets powers from. And it's like, I can't support that.
It's Morbin time, man. It's Morbin time.
Maybe there's some context in the movie that makes that make sense. And if by the time you're listening to this, many of you probably have already seen the movie and are like screaming at me about it. But I will probably go see it. I think I could carve out the time to go see Craven.
All right. Well, I do like the idea of like Patreon, like let's give Mark and Dan a movie night. I don't know how like the Patreon could like convince our wives that this is time well spent, but we could try.
Yeah. I swear they're dying for us to talk about these things.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, you know what? If you want to talk about it, whether Mark and I have seen it or not, come jump into the Slack. Our Amazing Spider Slack is our little community of like roughly 1,000 of our listeners who talk about Spider-Man and related things every day. They've truly become like some of my closest friends on the internet. It's like a really tight-knit club. So if you haven't already jumped in, maybe it'll be talking about Kraven the Hunter with me on there that will get you to do it. Come join our Slack.
All right, Dan. I wanted to spend the second half of this episode talking a little bit about just overall transition periods on Spider books, just because I just felt it was extra prescient and relevant to what we're experiencing right now with 8 Deaths of Spider-Man. I also think this was like a pretty historically significant transition period, because really outside of the period where Stan Lee dropped off the book and Roy Thomas wrote a handful of issues that kind of like kept the seat warm for Jerry Conway, we really haven't gotten stuff like this before, like a specific period of just like inventory books and other things and major events just to kind of tie things over until the creative run, as it were, got set. I mean, we would have fill-in issues, but like even that feels very different from what this was in this era. So like, what's your take overall on transition periods? I mean, we talked a little bit about it when we talked about 8 Deaths of Spider-Man, and I think we were at the time like, oh, it could be fun, but I guess more historically, what do you think about it?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because like it got me thinking, about like other transition periods. Like after the Michelinie run, it's kind of like constant transition.
Yeah.
Like the like mid to late 90s was a lot of like different voices popping in and off here and there. This is the last like real sustained run on the title for a while.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess Mackie comes on and he does a number of years on the title.
Right.
But like, Michelinie's is like a pretty sustained thing and matching with records. So like what we kind of got in this transition period is kind of indicative of like what we would get for a lot of the period that you and I have been reading the title, whether it's the, something like more cohesive, if you want to call the Clone Saga cohesive, during that period, and Brand New Day, which, obviously was under a certain umbrella, but still saw a lot of like people coming off and on, and a lot of stories that were probably inventory stories that got elevated.
Right.
So like, I think this period actually kind of provides a really interesting look into like the future of the title and like what you would get for sustained periods of time. I think there's a lot of like ups and downs to this kind of thing. I mean, I'm all for like more voices coming in to the title. Like I think the points where I get most bored with Amazing Spider-Man is when people are on the book for a great deal of time. We were practically begging Dan Slott to get off of the title towards the end of his run. And it's not even necessarily about quality more than it is just like, I want to hear another person's take on this, and also know that it's not going to be there forever, which I think is why I like Brand New Day so much. It just feels fresh all the time. But as much as I don't think the ending of Beyond necessarily stuck the landing, and as much as I think that 8 Deaths of Spider-Man is a very weird transition so far, and as much as I like the stories here, I think if I were to like plan a transition, it would be much more organized around a kind of like short idea like Beyond or 8 Deaths is doing than what this one is. even though I like the books in this a lot more.
Yeah.
But I think there's something cool about that, like just kind of doing a deviated thing and coming back for like something bigger. I don't know. What do you think?
What's interesting about it is, especially if you talk about it in the context of like this period here and then like beyond, and even like what you were referring to, like in the mid to late 90s when it was kind of jumping around because of the Clone Saga and JMD coming and going and the DeFalco coming and going. And a lot of those transition books were happening out of necessity because it was just like we kind of got caught unawares, I mean, like in this current run, it was, basically Christopher Priest imploding, and Shooter leaving, in terms of, most recently with Beyond, it was Nick Spencer kind of leaving unexpectedly. And it was a good way to kind of like rearrange the deck chairs and get things set up for the next long-term run. And I feel like, I think in both instances, post this run and post Beyond, it was a successful trend. It successfully handed things off. Like Zeb Wells got the run, whether you liked his run or not. And I think we are more of the opinion that we liked it. So we don't have to convince ourselves of this, but I feel like it was, it gave him the runway to get his ideas set up so that he could start doing all the stuff with YEP and Tombstone and all that. Like it got John Romita his head start on things, and I think it was successful. And I think certainly in this one, it was successful in getting McFarlane off of Batman and set up so that he could basically reinvent Spider-Man with Michelinie, who was just a very solid, steady, good storyteller, and who it was just a great match. So I'm curious, again, going further into modern context here, how that translates to Eight Deaths, because from our understanding, this is, Zeb's departure was planned. You have been predicting it for about a year.
And Nick Lowe outright kind of says it. Like he said, this one wasn't out of necessity. Even though they've never admitted that the Nick Spencer one was out of necessity.
Yeah.
I think anybody could read the tea leaves there, like they weren't given a ton of time, but like he said, I enjoyed Beyond so much that I felt like it was nice to do a transition between arcs. And at the time of recording this, we don't know what follows Eight Deaths.
I mean, like, look, if what follows next is the Justina Ireland arc, which I think is a possibility. I have no inside information. I don't know if you have anything at this point, but like I'm just throwing that out there. Like I wouldn't be shocked if that's what ends up happening. I mean, then this gives them an opportunity to get her out there on the main book. I know she did that miniseries, but like we can see, and maybe it could be another example of a successful handoff. If doing this and then it's like, no, we're gonna do the Mark Guggenheim run. I again, no inside info. I'm just throwing names out there here, people. I guess we'll see if this really helps or not. But yeah, to the original point, I do like this idea, and frankly, I think we're going to see a lot more of this in modern comics. So I feel like there's a part of me that's like almost like, even if you're not necessarily a fan and you want more hardcore consistency, I think you have to kind of, I think readers are going to have to open their minds to stuff like this. And like maybe going back to this era is a good way to kind of prepare yourself and steel your loins a bit about it, because I think this is just what's going to be happening with comics now. I think this is an industry where it's going to be very difficult to get, I mean, David Michelinie wrote this book for how many years? I know I'm asking. I'm supposed to be the expert here, and I'm like, could someone do my research for me? But
I think it's like 7 or 8 years, if I had to guess.
Yeah, and I just don't think you can get that kind of commitment from people anymore. Or even if you got a level of commitment, I just don't think. I think that it's an independent contractor's world for the most part. They're going to be moving from thing to thing, and projects are going to come up, and delays are going to happen, or they're going to get a creator book, or they're going to do whatever. And these periods of transition are going to become the norm. Or it's like, this is the only way we can get XYZ on this book is to fill the space for 6 months with something. So I think this is going to become very, very common, especially in a book like Amazing Spider-Man that double ships. So I think, I like it anyway, but like, I also feel like I think readers just need to adjust to expecting this. And, this is a good period as any to kind of get yourself adjusted.
Well, I think it was appropriate that we started this conversation about this transition by talking about Jim Salicrup, because I think most of these transitions, to end up happening when editorial is kind of falling apart, or they can't get ahead enough to really make, like a solid, long-lasting status quo, happen. And so you get a lot of these transition stories, and this is not a knock on any editor. And I think maybe like what you're expressing, isn't necessarily like, in the modern editor sense, Nick Lowe's fault more than it is just the reality of like how long people are willing to stay on the book. Although, I mean, Zeb did 60 issues.
Yeah.
Spencer did 75 plus, and Slott did what? Nearly 200 issues.
Right.
Like those are, historically, those are really solid long runs of Spider-Man comics. We talk about the Roger Stern run all the time, but that was what, 30 some issues,
Right.
So things change, things don't change, and timelines are accelerated and yada, yada, yada. But, I think how good these things are really comes down to whether an editor can shape them up to make them work, because otherwise a book becomes completely without form if it's, moving through a constant state of change. To that point, we haven't said the name Steve Wacker today, but like, if you're talking about transition, there's an editor that oversaw, maybe more change within his office than anyone else, and yet made it feel very smooth. And so like, I would be down for this approach if I felt like we had an editor that was like talented enough to manage that. And Jim Salicrup, I mean, I don't know, bring him back again, get him off paper cuts.
There you go.
That's the level of talent I think that's needed to wrestle something like what you're discussing.
Yeah, for sure. I do want to talk about a couple of the drawbacks though, just to spell it out for people. I mean, like, and again, like, I think this current run from the 80s here is a good example of it, but like overall, like these transition periods can lack cohesion. I mean, I think we saw that during Beyond. I mean, like, from creative team to creative team, it did not have the flow of, say, what Brand New Day had, even though you had different voices. It just felt too disparate. Now, we talked about this earlier in this episode, but like, I feel like we had some happy accidents during this run in the 80s here. Like the fact that we had just married Peter and MJ, and I think having them be married made Kraven's Last Hunt a stronger story. And
agree.
And like JMD worked it in, but like, as you noted, a lot of it was just, MJ staring out a window. And then of course, the big scene that I always think of is, Peter pulling himself out of the grave saying, "I love you," which is, obviously has far more power to it when he's married. But like, you do have to be like, well, you kind of lucked out into that one, you know what I mean? Like, because that's not how the book was written originally, you know what I mean? So like, with
there's no way. Like 2 issues earlier was the big change,
right?
And not only married, but like freshly married adds a lot to it.
Yeah.
And there's the great scene where, and we'll talk about this in our Kraven's Last Hunt, episode, but like, of Peter returning home to Mary Jane, is really touching.
Yeah.
So
yeah, but I mean, we're talking about like some of the greatest comic book creators of all time making something work where it maybe shouldn't have. And you can't necessarily expect that to be the norm. So while this kind of bucks that trend, it's worth noting that cohesion or lack of cohesion can be problematic in these runs. And I think, like, to that point, like, when you're throwing all these, like, especially like inventory stories out there, you know, like your hit percentage goes down, in my opinion. Like, yeah, like The Wedding and Kraven's Last Hunt are like legendary stories, but like Mad Dog Ward is not. And even though they were my first books, that Doc Ock story is not a hit. You know what I mean? It is a very, I don't even know if it cracks the top 20 in Dr. Octopus stories with Spider-Man. You know what I mean? Like that's how low on the list it is. So
well, I think also to that point, like tonally, it's all over the place.
Sure.
You know, like Kraven's Last Hunt ends with someone committing suicide, you know, and the Dr. Octopus story, as much as it's interested in like his like psychological state, it's very, like you said, like Silver Age, you know, kind of stuff. And it feels like a weird regression from what you were reading in Kraven's Last Hunt. And both things deserve their space, but maybe not quite so back to back like that. Which feels like the other transitions. Like that was something we knocked Beyond about, which was like you get a Zeb Wells issue that really is selling you on, you know, Peter and Ben's relationship and them going to take on Beyond, only for, you know, Kelly Thompson, who's a writer I like in most other situations, coming in and doing issues where they're doing sandwich jokes in what are supposed to be like a penultimate issues of a very like dramatic storyline, you know, and
not dramatic, Dan, traumatic. Okay. It's going to traumatize.
Traumatic.
It's going to traumatize you, Dan. Sorry. But yeah, so, I mean, agreed with all of that. And I, you know, not to completely contradict what I was saying a few minutes ago, but I think overall, like, I like these periods. I like the possibilities that these periods do, but I also think it can only be done in small doses. Like, because like at the end of the day, I like reading Amazing Spider-Man because I like seeing an artist's and a creator's statement on who and what Spider-Man is for a period. And I feel like you can only do that through a sustained run. And like some of these other, like Brand New Day is probably the biggest exception. And like, yes, like I know I said Jim Salicrup's probably the best editor, but like Stephen Wacker is probably, you know, if Salicrup's 1A, Wacker's probably 1B in my mind. And
yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about Brand New Day in I don't know how many years, Mark,
right.
But like the more you like read stuff like this, the more you realize what a miracle was that book made any sense at all.
Yes, for sure. So like let's just disqualify Brand New Day from this conversation. Not to contradict ourselves too much, but for the most part, like especially like that 90s period we were alluding to earlier, like not having a consistent vision on the book, I think really hurt it. You know, like it was too much transition. And like I you know, even like the transition, I just feel like you could do this for a couple of months, but then, you know, once you do that, we got to get into like the main event, if you will, and then, you know, but you know, at the same time, it also helps keep it from having the Dan Slott situation, which was, you know, one voice for too long. So pluses and minuses.
You don't want to go on a cruise where the captain is changing every other day.
No, but you don't also want to go.
I don't know what that would look like, but it sounded like a smart thing to say.
No, it does. But like, you also don't want to go on a cruise where, you know, you just play the same like racquetball every day. You know what I mean? Like you want some other stuff to do.
Yeah. Or maybe we could go back to your jazz metaphor from the Dan Slott run, where it's like you don't want to change who's leading the jazz band every 5 minutes.
There you go.
There you go. We'll find a way to make it back to music in some way.
Yep.
Well, Mark, this was a fun discussion, and I think helped us kind of like articulate perhaps things that you and I have never really talked about on the show before, and hopefully it finds its way into our coverage of 8 Deaths of Spider-Man as we kind of consider these kind of moments in the history of the book. But Yeah, why don't you bring us home for the episode?
There's another transition, Dan. It's that time for all good things to come to an end. So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning into this episode of Season 7 of the Amazing Spider Talk. On the next episode of Season 7, we're going to be talking about the only annual that officially doesn't count. That's Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 21, The Spider Marriage. We have a special guest lined up for that episode who is here to defend the merits of a married Peter Parker. So we hope you will gather here together and tune in a couple of weeks for this very special episode. And of course, hear it on Patreon first.
Yeah, this podcast exists because of the support of our listeners on Patreon. For only $3.99 a month, less than a copy of a new issue of Amazing Spider-Man, you can help support our show's existence while getting early episodes like that episode Mark just talked about, and the reviews of all of the latest Amazing Spider-Man comics the same week that they release in stores. Sometimes even early, depending on if Diamond is having problems. So that's an awesome exclusive bonus to all of our members on Patreon. So we say thank you to everybody who already supports us and our work.
If you value Smart's comics criticism and historical analysis, we hope you'll consider supporting us on Patreon. What we do on the show is admittedly niche. Still, we feel that we offer valuable commentary and model fair methods of criticism for a character and medium that deserves greater consideration and thought than it typically receives. So if these discussions and interviews are valuable to you, we can only continue doing what we do with your support on Patreon.
So Mark, until we are finally forced into our own Mad Dogs ward, when the public realizes the insanity of us podcasting about Spider-Man for 12 years, what's our motto?
With great podcasts, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk.